Emmerdale teases that dark secrets long buried beneath the quiet surface of the village are beginning to stir once more. Whispers travel faster than the wind, and a creeping unease sets in as death shrouds the air of the Dales again. This time, it's personal. This time, it's something darker. It began in the weeks following Nate's sudden and devastating death. The village, still in shock, stumbled forward with disbelief, anger, and overwhelming grief. Among those most shattered were Kane and Tracy. Kane, stoic yet tormented, had always prided himself on protecting his own, but Nate's loss cut deeper than he dared to admit. Tracy, devastated and emotionally raw, oscillated between blame and heartbreak. It wasn't long before the pair, already burdened with a strained history, began turning on each other. Arguments exploded in the woolpack and spilled into the streets. Harsh words were exchanged, and old wounds reopened. Tracy accused Kane of being too reckless, too consumed with vengeance and blind fury. Kane lashed back, accusing Tracy of distracting Nate, weakening him, making him vulnerable. Their grief mutated into guilt, and their guilt became a blade they turned upon each other again and again. But even as they tore into each other, something began to shift. It started at Nate's funeral. The village had gathered, dressed in black, weighed down with sorrow. The air was thick with mourning, but beneath the grief stirred suspicion. Tracy stood near the coffin, her eyes never leaving Kane, who lingered at the edge of the graveyard, fists clenched. And then, in the moments after the final words were spoken and the soil began to fall, the two found themselves alone. The fight that ensued was bitter, filled with regret, fury, and unbearable sadness. But in their shouting match, a memory surfaced. A detail both had dismissed earlier. Nate had mentioned, weeks before his death, that he believed he was being followed. Someone lurking in the shadows, someone he couldn't quite see. He thought it was paranoia. But now, neither Kane nor Tracy believed it was. That memory bound them together, forged an uneasy alliance. For the first time in weeks, their eyes weren't turned on each other, but instead toward the possibility that Nate's death wasn't a tragic accident, or a misstep, it was murder. As they began quietly questioning others in the village, strange inconsistencies began to surface. John, who had always been the quiet, unassuming one, helpful in the community, invisible in many ways, was now behaving oddly. Too interested. Too present. Too polished. When questioned, his timeline didn't quite add up. His reaction to Nate's death was performative at best. Kane, whose instincts were honed like a blade, began to circle. But John was no fool. He had been watching too. He had seen Kane and Tracy inch closer together, sensed the shift in their dynamic. He knew the danger that posed. And so, he acted. He created an alibi, one airtight enough to satisfy the police, and more chillingly, he found a scapegoat. Owen. Owen was troubled, certainly. He had a history of aggression, had once threatened Nate during a bar brawl. Easy to paint him as a killer. John lured him in, played the concerned friend, then ended his life in a way that screamed guilt. A staged confession, a forged suicide note, and suddenly, the case was closed. The police informed the village that the killer had been found, that Nate's death was resolved. The villagers began to relax, their suspicions soothed. Closure, finally. But Kane did not believe it. Nor did Tracy. Nor did Robert. Robert, sharp-eyed and methodical, had been quietly tracking inconsistencies as well. And the Owen story didn't sit right with him. Too neat. Too convenient. He began pulling threads, starting with the timeline of Owen's supposed confession. He interviewed villagers, poked at police records, and cross-referenced sightings. It didn't add up. The more he uncovered, the more he pressed Kane to look deeper. John, sensing the walls closing in, began to unravel. The guilt, long buried, began to claw at his sanity. Every shadow seemed to whisper Nate's name. Every time he passed Kane or Tracy in the village, their eyes seemed to bore into him with silent accusation. He stopped sleeping. He began pacing. Drinking. Mumbling to himself. Eventually, he called a helpline. He couldn't take the pressure. The voice on the other end tried to guide him toward coping, to de-escalate his spiraling. But John was beyond help. The calls became more frequent, desperate. He began ranting about people turning on him, about betrayal, about being hunted. He started to fantasize that maybe, just maybe, if he took control, if he silenced those getting too close, he could breathe again. He began following Robert. Robert noticed. At first, he dismissed it. But then it became too obvious. The same shadow on the street corner, the same figure parked 2 cars back. He confided in Kane. Kane told him to keep calm, to act normal, to not tip off the real killer. They would need to draw him out, force a mistake. Kane began trailing John in return. But John, cornered by fear and madness, was already steps ahead. He knew Robert was the linchpin, the one person whose logic and determination could unravel everything. And so, he planned. He planted evidence. He began framing Robert, slowly, insidiously. An anonymous tip to the police here, a mysterious item found in Robert's shed there. Rumors, carefully seeded. He needed the village to turn their suspicion elsewhere. But Robert wasn't backing down. He confronted John in public. Calmly, with facts. Dates. Times. Questions only the killer would know the answers to. John stammered, evaded, then laughed it off. But he was trembling. That night, he smashed everything in his flat. The guilt and paranoia boiled over. And yet, beneath it all, a twisted thrill had begun to take hold. The power. The control. The feeling of dancing along the edge of discovery, and still managing to stay hidden. It seduced him. He started to believe he was untouchable. But he was not. Kane, Tracy, and Robert had begun laying a trap. The 3, now working in secret, shared everything they knew. They mapped out John's movements. Kane used his contacts to dig into John's past, and what he found was chilling, an incident in another town, unsolved. A missing person. John had been there. Briefly. Mysteriously. Robert obtained CCTV footage from the night of Owen's supposed suicide. It didn't place Owen at the location where the suicide was staged. Instead, it showed him arguing with John at the edge of the woods. Minutes later, Owen vanished. The footage was grainy, unclear, but damning. And now, they wait. They know John is spiraling. They know he'll make a move. The only question is, who will he strike next?